Resident Evil 3 on the PS5. Now, after playing Resident Evil 2, my expectations for the next installments were off the charts. I went into Resident Evil 3 with high expectations. When I went into Resident Evil 3, I was expecting something that will build upon what the Resident Evil 2 remake had built, and of course, go into new territories. So how did it line up? Well, in Resident Evil 3, you again play as two protagonists. The first is Jill Valentine, and the second protagonist is Carlos. In terms of story, you actually begin the game as Jill Valentine, who is a former STARS officer. STARS is like the kind of SWAT team of the Resident Evil franchise. They gather information about a certain rescue mission, and then of course they go in. So Jill Valentine is a returning character from Resident Evil 1. She's dealing with PTSD from the events of the first game. She wakes up with this horrible nightmare. Even though she left STARS, she's still continuing her investigative journey by trying to find links between this evil corporation called Umbrella and the T-virus, which is responsible for the zombie outbreak. She's in her apartment investigating this case, drawing up links, when all of a sudden a giant hulking creature just crashes through her apartment and chases her through the streets of Raccoon City. As she runs through the streets of Raccoon City, the streets themselves are being sieged by zombies. You see fire, destruction, death everywhere. People are being eaten alive, people are running away, as Jill is being chased by this hulking creature, this mysterious creature. Eventually, Jill meets up with Carlos, who is the second protagonist. Carlos is a mercenary type figure that actually works directly with the Umbrella Corporation. Jill and Carlos decide to put their differences aside to help some survivors escape who are located in this train, in an underground train station. Jill, of course, needs to power up the train station so the train can leave. And as she kind of does that, she realizes Carlos has been tasked by his superiors to stay back in Raccoon City to find a doctor who can find a cure, a vaccine for the T-virus, which is responsible for the zombie outbreak. Of course, Jill realizes the night isn't over yet. Now, in terms of gaming mechanics, Resident Evil 3 very closely follows the mechanics introduced by Resident Evil 2. The only real difference is you now have a dodging mechanic. So whenever an enemy comes your way, press R1 and you can kind of dodge the enemies. For Carlos, if you press R1, he pushes the enemies away, more of a parrying attack. Starting off with the good things about this game, the graphics are just as good as Resident Evil 2. You know, the detail, they are using the RE engine, so you do get a lot of the assets from Resident Evil 2 brought here, along with, of course, many new different assets. Jill Valentine and Carlos, along with other characters, again, great character models. The presentation is fantastic, just like Resident Evil 2, it's carried over here. Now, in terms of story, the great thing about this game is instead of having two separate protagonists, which you can choose to play as in Resident Evil 2, now both of these stories are interwoven together. It's one single storyline. And this actually helps a lot because rather than having to play the game twice to kind of get the full picture, one run through will do it. And so I thought that was a massive improvement over Resident Evil 2. Another thing worth mentioning is that big giant hulking creature that interrupts Jill in the beginning and chases her throughout her apartment and the streets. Actually chases her throughout the game. This hulking creature, Jill comes to find out, is called Nemesis. Nemesis is actually the main antagonist of the story. Nemesis is the main bad guy. Nemesis is built upon Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. In Resident Evil 2, you had this character called Mr. X who wears this black fedora and long trench coat, again, a hulking creature. And Mr. X kind of stalks you around the police station. It just comes out of nowhere. And once you see Mr. X, you just have to be out of that area. Otherwise, once he catches you, he will kill your character. However, the Nemesis character is far beyond that, because every time Jill makes progress, you know, when she solves a puzzle or when she kind of unlocks a new area, Nemesis always turns up to kind of foil her plans and, you know, put her in some kind of a disaster. At different intervals of the story, as you kind of face off Nemesis, you think you've eliminated Nemesis, this Nemesis character always returns bigger and more equipped than before. Nemesis starts off as this giant hulking humanoid, and throughout his return, he turns more beastly and more gnarly. Another great thing about Resident Evil 3 is that at this point in the franchise, it nails down the formula that it will use for most of the other games that would come ahead, which is Resident Evil games are procedural games mixed with speculative sci-fi and horror. The procedural aspect comes from the fact that, you play as a military type of figure or a rookie cop or some kind of character that typically works for an institution that has the capability of investigating situations, and of course they can handle weapons. And this kind of helps push the story forward. It makes sense why these characters would be able to decipher these clues and these puzzles, while at the same time being able to kind of handle themselves. The speculative sci-fi angle comes from the fact that everything is mostly explained by science, of course fictionalized science, but they don't overtly use magic or sorcery to explain things. They try to just ground it to observable elements that can explain what's happening. This is a virus that was caused by a large pharmaceutical company. There's an outbreak, and of course things go from bad to worse once it reaches the populace. And lastly, the horror angle, of course, comes down to the lack of resources. In the Resident Evil games, you have to be very resourceful. When you start off the game, you can only carry around 8 small items. So you have to be very, very smart as to, what you're willing to hold in your inventory and what you might have to discard to make room for more important items. And this does add to the tension. You are on the edge of your seat throughout a lot of the game. This now leads me to the more negatives about the game. While I was playing Resident Evil 3, I couldn't help but feel this is more of a iterative sequel and not necessarily a fully blown sequel where everything is evolved from all different angles. This is more like a very massively expanded DLC. That's not a bad thing because you do get a different context to it. And especially if you buy this game on sale, I mean, you definitely can't miss this. But as a full price type of game, it does feel a bit too much like a DLC expansion than a fully blown sequel to Resident Evil 2. Another issue I saw with the game was with the writing. There was a lack of tension between Jill Valentine and Carlos. I mean, the two characters are set up for conflict. Jill Valentine is investigating the Umbrella Corporation. This organization has more or less ruined her life. And Carlos directly works for the Umbrella Corporation. So I couldn't help but feel as if, there should have been a bit more tension, especially in the first half between Jill and Carlos. And then of course, that would make the second half make more sense as the two characters work together. Another issue with the game is Jill's PTSD. In the beginning, you're immediately introduced to Jill, who has this nightmare, this actually quite frightening nightmare, which signifies her PTSD. And because the story moves along so fast and the game is actually a lot shorter than Resident Evil 2, the PTSD is never really mentioned again. There's no real closure. Again, it's a minor gripe, but because the story starts off with that, it does linger in your mind. So Resident Evil 3 Remake on the PS5 and the PS5 Pro. My background with this was that I played it on the base level PS5 first, and the performance was just like the first time I played Resident Evil 2, locked onto about 54 frames per second. Graphically, it's amazing with the ray tracing on. My second run through of it was on the PS5 Pro, and again, the PS5 Pro takes it up to 60 frames per second locked smooth. Because the PS5 Pro doesn't have that kind of AI sharpening tool that the regular PS5 has, things do look a bit more smoother. But again, both machines play well. I think you'll have a great time with the game no matter which platform you decide to play on. So Resident Evil 3 on the PS5, I'll say give it a go. It is a great follow-up to Resident Evil 2. I wouldn't say it's as replayable as Resident Evil 2. You do kind of get to see some story elements explained a bit better here. I would say, yeah, if you do find it on sale, go ahead and get it. It's a hell of a time.